Hello and welcome to the very first video in my new series looking at the AQA GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. There are 12 videos that I'm going to provide in total. They start in 1920 and end in 1973, and we'll look at some of the really big momentous changes that happened to American society in those years. All of these videos will be found on the #HisTV YouTube channel, where lots of other history teachers have recorded videos for their students so they can continue studying for their GCSEs at home. The very first lesson of this series is called, or the title, the question we're going to look at is, what were the key characteristics of America's economic boom in the 1920s? 1920 starts a period of what's called economic prosperity, which basically just means wealth for the American people. So we're going to examine some of the really big changes that took place in America as a result of this increased wealth, but we're also going to look at the other side of what's called the economic boom. There were many people who didn't experience this wealth, particularly those that lived in rural countryside areas. So we're going to have a really balanced look at this as well. Let's make a start. So there are 5 key areas we're going to examine in answering the question, what were the key characteristics of the economic boom? The first one is looking at the benefits of the boom. So we're going to have a look at why the boom took place and then how that generally impacted America. And also we'll discuss why it's called a boom in the first place. We're going to examine the main policies of the Republican Party. This was the party, the political party, that was in control or in power in America throughout most of the 1920s. We're then also going to have a look at the impact of this economic prosperity on American society. We're going to have a look at the rise in advertising and the way that it encouraged the American people to be part of what's called consumer society and consumer culture. We're then going to examine the impact that Henry Ford, a great inventor and engineer, and his motor industry had on the economic boom, and how the car and the development of something called the production line led to lots of other big changes in America. And then, as I mentioned, it's really important to remember that actually for a lot of American people, they did not share this prosperity. So we're also going to have a look at something called the inequalities of wealth and look at how some people had prosperity but others didn't. So those are the 5 key areas we're going to cover in this video today. Let's start by looking at the benefits of the boom then, and we're going to start by looking at America's economic strength at the end of World War I. America came out of World War I in a very strong position. Although the war started in 1914, America had a policy that's called isolationism. They stayed out, they isolated themselves from the other countries of the world that were at war. And so they only joined the war in 1917. In the meantime, they'd lent money to their allies in Europe, they'd sold munitions, which means weapons, and the things you use in war. They'd sold those to Britain and France and made a huge amount of money. And America itself is an absolutely vast country with huge amounts of natural resources. They had easy access to iron and coal and timber. They had all the things that you would need to be able to build big cities very quickly. So America came out of World War I in a very strong position. So the 1920s generally is known by historians as a time of an economic boom. Think about the word boom itself, it suggests an explosion, something big happening, something happening very rapidly. And so we use this term to suggest or to explain the way that America's economy, the money of the country, went through this period of very, very quick increase. So America got very rich very quickly. This was a time when unemployment was low. Millions of American people had jobs, and in those jobs they were working in factories where huge quantities of goods that were exported and sent all around the world were produced. And so many Americans had access to a new consumer society where you were encouraged to spend. We'll look later on at the Republican policies, but one of them was low taxes. People had money in their pockets that they were able to spend, disposable income they could spend and invest in American society. And finally, then, this is a time of massive growth of cities. Huge cities like New York grew incredibly quickly. There was more building being done in the 1920s in America than at any other time in the history of the USA. This is the time of skyscrapers, and this is a time where people were attracted to the cities for these new opportunities that led to something called urbanization, where rural areas, green landscapes are kind of transferred into bigger cities and people move towards those in kind of looking for a better life, I should say. So those are the main benefits of the boom. This is a time of economic prosperity and wealth. We've covered the benefits then. Let's have a look at the Republican Party policies that enabled the boom to take place. So the Republican Party was in power throughout the 1920s, and they had 3 main policies that you need to know about that helped the boom to continue. The first of those is something called laissez-faire, which means to leave alone in French. And if you look at the icon, I'm kind of trying to show you that this is the government not getting involved. So laissez-faire policy underpinned all of the other Republican policies, and this is the idea that the government should interfere as little as possible with the day-to-day lives of the people. And this limited government interference allowed businessmen to continue expanding their businesses and making money. The idea was basically that if things are going really, really well, we don't need to get involved. We'll keep out of it and things will keep evolving and happening, and the economic prosperity will continue. The second main policy is something called tariffs. America and the American government wanted people to buy American goods. And so a tariff is basically a tax that you put on any products that are brought in or imported from other countries into America. If you tax goods that are coming into America, the owners of those goods have to put the price up, and that basically made foreign goods more expensive and encouraged people to buy from American companies, investing back into the American economy. And the final policy that I mentioned earlier was low taxation. This allowed the American people to keep more of the money that they'd earned from their jobs, and this gave them what's called more disposable income. They had more money in their pockets that they could spend every month. And because of tariffs, this was then spent on American products and further boosted American business. So the three main Republican Party policies, underpinned by their laissez-faire beliefs, helped the boom to continue throughout the 1920s. So we've ticked off benefits of the boom, Republican Party policies. Let's have a look now on the impact that this had on society. So this is a period where advertising became incredibly popular and well used, and then led to something called a consumer society. During the 1920s, goods were mass produced. They were made on absolutely huge scale. And because they were mass produced, they were then cheaper to make. And these lower prices meant that more Americans could afford more modern products. And because of low taxation, they had that disposable income to spend. And so telephones, radios, vacuum cleaners, washing machines were bought by millions of American people. Companies also realized that if they wanted to make money very quickly, they would need to advertise their goods. And so they used sales and marketing techniques to get people to buy their products. Now, during World War I, propaganda, persuading people of a certain view through posters and radio messages and adverts, they were used. And so they were inspired by propaganda. And so businesses used posters, they used radio adverts, they sent salesmen around the country to tell people to buy their products, and that boosted their sales further. And all of this is underpinned by something called hire purchase. If people did not have the money to buy the products up front, they were able to borrow the money from the banks, who then made money on the interest. And this is called hire purchase. It was introduced and it allowed people to buy now and pay later. The idea being that if you wanted to buy a car, you wouldn't have to have all the money for the car up front. You could pay it off little bit by little bit, and at the end you would then own that car. In the 1920s, 80% of all radios and 60% of cars were bought using hire purchase. Many people at the time also bought shares in companies on the stock market in the hope their investment would grow. The principle behind this is that basically if a company is getting bigger and bigger and making more and more money, you can buy a small share or part of that company. As the company makes more money, the value of that share goes up, and you can then sell your share and you make the money on the difference. And people were borrowing money to buy these, and we'll see later on in this course how that actually led to a period of crisis for America. But what you need to take from this slide here is that goods were being mass produced, companies were relentlessly advertising their products, and because of hire purchase, lots of American people were able to then have access to these goods. So we've looked at the benefits of the boom, we've looked at the Republican Party policies, and we've also looked at the consumer society. Let's think now about how Henry Ford and the motor industry revolutionized the American economy further. In 1913, Henry Ford set up the first moving production line, otherwise known sometimes as an assembly line, in a place called Detroit. Each worker on the line had a small job to do, and the idea was that the car would move very, very slowly through the factory. Each worker would stand next to the production line and they'd have a very small job to do. One person would fit the steering wheel. One person would do the stitching on the seats. One person would sort the engine out. And so this allowed two things to happen. Firstly, it allowed the mass production of cars. Cars could be made incredibly quickly, but it also created millions of jobs for low-skilled workers. People working in car factories didn't need to be able to do the stitching for the leather steering wheel and do the engine and do the tyres. They had one small job to do, and that created millions of jobs for people. The most famous car that was produced during this time was called the Model T Ford. The car was standardized, and that means that every single car was the same, and this made them easier and quicker to produce, and it kept the price down. It made them very affordable for the people. There's a very, very famous Henry Ford quote where he said, "You can have any color you want as long as it's black." By making it exclusively in one color, one shape, one size, the car was the same, it was cheaper. And so 50 million Model T Fords were made between 1908 and 1925. And by 1927, one car was being produced every 10 seconds. This is a time of mass production. Now, the car industry and the popularity of the car industry then boosted lots of other industries as well. Thousands of jobs were created in other industries, including glass, leather, steel, rubber. If you're going to make millions of cars, you need material for the tires, for the windows, for the seats, for the car body. And so lots of other industries were really positively impacted as well. Construction became the biggest employer in the 1920s. You need millions of miles of new roads. Motels, hotels basically on the side of the road were built. Gas stations need to be built as well. And car ownership allowed people to live further away from the cities in the suburbs, the areas around them, leading to a boom in house building. Cities grew and grew and grew as people could live further and further away from the centre and commute using their car. So the car industry revolutionised American society. Once the production line was made, lots of other products could be manufactured in the same way. Now, I've talked very positively about this time for America, and of course, for a lot of people, it was a time of economic prosperity. But one thing I really want you to remember from this is that not every single American person experienced this boom. So let's finish off this video by looking at the inequalities of wealth. Although this was a period of prosperity, around half of the population was still living in poverty. Farmers did not share in this prosperity in the 1920s. At the very beginning of the year, many farmers were growing as much produce as they could sell. But eventually, they were making more than people wanted to buy, and this is known as overproduction. And so as the demand for their products fell, the income of farmers fell as well, from $22 billion in 1919 to $13 billion by 1928. The income of farmers across America fell by almost half. Workers in old industries, old traditional American industries such as coal and leather and textiles, did not benefit from the boom. During the 1920s, America was starting to rely on oil and electricity, and that replaced the need for coal. Man-made materials like nylon replaced the need for old leather and textiles. And although business owners continued to get rich, their workers actually didn't get paid incredibly well, and their wages grew very, very slowly. So for workers, particularly in old industries, they didn't experience this prosperity. Finally then, although the invention of the production line was very positive in some ways, by making a production line and introducing machines, it then means that actually you don't need many other workers. And so very few new jobs were created during the 1920s boom. And if you were from a minority background, so poor white Americans, but then also African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and immigrants to the country often found themselves unemployed, and they were not looked after by the state because, remember, the government believes in laissez-faire policy. You do not interfere in the lives of the people. So we've looked at the key question: what were the key characteristics of America's economic boom in the 1920s? Remember, America was in a very strong position after World War I, and this was a time for some people of economic prosperity. The Republican Party policies, particularly laissez-faire, allowed that to continue happening. Businesses grew, advertised their products, and encouraged people to be involved in consumer society. And then the invention of the production line, which then revolutionized the motor industry and made Henry Ford an incredibly rich man, then impacted loads of other industries as well. But finally, this was a time of inequality. For some Americans, this was a time of economic prosperity, but for around half the population, they were living in poverty. That brings me to the end of our first video. Have a look at the next video, which will then look at the key features of popular culture during the boom, and have a look at #HisTV YouTube channel for other videos on this topic. Thanks for watching.